Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we have taken a New Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 4th April 2023. Topics for today's discussion are displayed on your screen. Let's begin the discussion. So the first topic of today's discussion is inspired from this news which featured on page number 2 of the Hindu newspaper. Now Delhi High Court has served a stern warning against the frivolous public interest litigations, that is PIL. The Delhi High Court said that courts must be careful in considering whether those approaching them with PILs are bona fides or acting out of personal or political motives. In an strongly worded comment, Delhi High Court registered that PILs which are motivated pose a grave danger to the credibility of the judicial process and also have the propensity of endangering the credibility of other institutions and undermining public faith in democracy and the rule of law. Now, if you will trace the relevance of this news from the perspective of UPSC examination, General Studies Paper 2 mentions about separation of powers between various organs, that is executive, legislative and judiciary. Apart from this, your syllabus also mentions structure, organization and functioning of judiciary and their role in polity. If you will look at previous year question in 2020, UPSC has asked a 15 marker question based on PIL. Question was, judicial legislation is antithetical to the doctrine of separation of power as envisaged in the Indian Constitution. In this context, justify the filing of large number of PILs praying for issuing guidelines to executive authority. So in this discussion, we will be looking at into what is PIL, what is its origin and how it evolved, what are the significance of the PIL, what are the issues related to the process of PIL, and what is way ahead or a conclusion. So let's begin the discussion. Now let us first understand what is PIL, that is public interest litigation. Now in simpler terms, it is a legal action brought in a court of law for the enforcement of public interest, as the name suggests, in which the general public or a class of the community has some interest and which may have an effect on their legal rights or responsibilities is known as public interest litigation. Now, is there any statute that defines PIL? Answer is no. PIL has not been defined in any Indian statute. However, courts in various judgments have interpreted and defined PIL. As the Supreme Court of India in the case of Janata Dal versus H.S. Chaudhary case in 1993 held that expression PIL means a legal action started in a court of law for the enforcement of public interest where the public or a particular class of the public has some interest that affects their legal rights or liabilities. Now another question that arises is, what is the source of the public interest litigation? United States of America was the source of the term public interest litigation, which was intended to provide legal representation to previously unrepresented groups such as disadvantaged members of racial minorities, unorganized consumers and individuals who were enthusiastic about environmental issues among others. Another important thing that is associated with PIL that yes, indeed, anyone can approach in filing PIL, but the petitioner must prove to the court's satisfaction that the petition is being filed in the public interest and not as a frivolous litigation. The court may take cognizance of the matter and proceed suo motu also. So now let us understand some other important basic facts related to PIL, like who can file PIL, against whom it can be filed, and what is locus standi. Now any citizen can file a PIL. Under Article 32, a person can file a PIL in Supreme Court. Under Article 226, The similar step can be taken for the High Court, and under Section 133 of the Criminal Procedure Code, one can file a petition in front of Magistrates Court. PIL can only be brought against central, state, or municipal governments. It cannot be brought against an individual. The government and Parliament of India, each state's government and legislatures, and all local or other authorities within the territory of India or under the control of the Government of India are all included in the definition of a state. Now, the concept of locus standi has been relaxed in the case of PILs so as to enable the Honorable Court to look into grievances that are filed on behalf of those who are poor, illiterate, deprived, or disabled and are unable to approach the court themselves. Now we all know that Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer and Justice P.N. Bhagwati are regarded as the pioneer in the field of public interest litigation. But how this concept came into picture? Did our constitution provide some clue to it? Answer is yes. If you will see Article 32 subclause 2, it reads as the Supreme Court shall have power to issue directions or orders or writs, including writs in the nature of habeas corpus, mandamus, prohibition, quo warranto, and certiorari. Now pay focus on the first line. It says that Supreme Court shall have power to issue direction, orders, or writs, including the following writs. This means it can devise its own strategy to give directions so as to enable it to deliver justice in true sense. And this term, including writs, was interpreted in a wider sense. And that brought a new device which came to be known as PIL, that is public interest litigation. Now we will look into evolution of public interest litigation through various important cases. Now first in the line is Mumbai Kamgar Sabha versus Abdul Thai case in 1976. In this case, Justice Krishna Iyer led the groundwork for the concept of PIL in India. Then another landmark case which came into picture was Hussain Ara Khatun versus State of Bihar case in the year 1979, which focused on the inhumane condition of the prisoners and under trial prisoners and resulted in the release of more than 40,000 under trial prisoners. It was the first PIL case to be reported. These prisoners had been denied the fundamental right to speedy justice and thus bringing the right to speedy justice in the mainstream of debate. A new era of PIL movement was heralded by Justice P.N. Bhagwati in the case of S.P. Gupta versus Union of India. In this case, it was held that any member of the public or social action group acting bona fide can invoke the writ jurisdiction of the High Courts or the Supreme Court seeking redressal against violation of legal or constitutional right. Thus, through this case, the concept of locus standi was relaxed. So, any person can file a petition to the Supreme Court or High Court on behalf of a person who is socially or economically not capable enough to approach the court. So by this judgment, PIL became a potent weapon for the enforcement of public duties. And as a result, any citizen of India or any consumer group or social action groups can now approach the apex court of the country seeking legal remedies in all cases where the interest of general public or section of public are at stake. Then another important case came in the year 1981. And it was case of Anil Yadav versus State of Bihar. It exposed the brutalities of police. Newspaper report revealed that about 33 suspected criminals were blinded by the police in Bihar by putting the acid into their eyes. Through interim orders, Supreme Court directed the state government to bring the blinded men to Delhi for medical treatment. It also ordered speedy prosecution of guilty policemen. The court also read that right to free legal aid as a fundamental right of every accused. and experts marked it as growth of social activism and investigative litigation. Another important case is the People's Union for Democratic Rights versus Union of India, that is PUDR versus Union of India. In 1982, the Supreme Court conceded that unusual measures were warranted to enable people the full realization of not merely their civil or political right, but the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights also. In this case, Supreme Court recognized that a third party could directly petition, whether through a letter or other means, and seek its intervention in matter where another party's fundamental rights were being violated. So what was said in SP Gupta case was reaffirmed in this PUDR versus Union of India case. Another important judgment came in India's Bank Association versus Dev Kala Consultancy. In this case, Supreme Court said that a private interest case can also be treated as a public interest case. That is, a person may approach the court for the redressal of his personal grievances, but court can take it as a public issue and can delve into affairs of the states. Thus, a private interest case can also be treated as public interest case. Another important case was MC Mehta versus Union of India case of 1987. In this case, Supreme Court held that petitioner, although not a riparian owner, still is entitled to move the court for the enforcement of his statutory provisions, as he is the person interested in protecting the lives of the people who make use of Ganga water. So through various cases, Supreme Court held that anybody can approach Supreme Court or High Court. It relaxed the locus standi provision. It said that private interest case can be taken as public interest case. It directed the authorities to do actions. It provided victims interim relief, and it also, in MC Mehta case, said that though the person is not a riparian owner of the stream, but still he is interested in the well-being or health of this river. So you can see how the concept of PIL evolved and gradually expanded the scope of the PIL. So let us look into what is the significance of the PIL. First and foremost important thing, that it is an instrument of social change. The litigants can focus attention and can also achieve results pertaining to larger public issues, especially in the field of human right, consumer welfare and environment. PIL is working as an instrument of social change. It is working for the welfare of every section of society. PIL has been used as a strategy to combat the atrocities prevailing in the society. It is an institutional initiative towards the welfare of the needy classes of the society. In Bandhu Mukti Morcha versus Union of India, Supreme Court ordered for the release of bonded laborers. In Murli S. Dogra versus Union of India, court banned smoking in the public places. Another very popular case is the Vishakha versus State of Rajasthan, in which Supreme Court provided guidelines which later become basis for the much awaited and warranted Prevention of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act. Another important significance is that it provides an option of affordable legal remedy. In PIL, vigilant citizen of the country can find an inexpensive legal remedy because there is only a nominal fixed court fee involved in this. PIL has also provided for accessibility of justice. This is done by relaxing the traditional rule of locus standi. So now any public spirited citizen or social action group can approach the court on behalf of the oppressed classes. Now, in exercise of adjudicating in the matters of PIL, Supreme Court and High Courts have devised new kind of reliefs. For example, the court can award interim compensation to the victims of governmental lawlessness, as is not the case with the traditional litigation methodologies. As you have already seen in the Anil Yadav case, that court directed the government to bring the victims to Delhi immediately. So these kind of devices have been innovated by the superior courts in pursuance of the PILs. Now, in most of the cases, the court has appointed its own socio-legal commissions of inquiry or has deputed its own official for investigation. Sometimes it has taken help of the National Human Rights Commission as well as CBI, along with inculcation of expert opinion to inquire into the matters of human rights violation. Now, PIL provides a tool in the hands of judiciary along with enhanced participation of the public to keep tab on executive and administrative actions. So, on one hand, it is an innovative tool for the judiciary as well as it has raised the public participation in such matters. Now, lastly, monitoring of state institutions such as jails, asylums, women protective home, juvenile home, and others has been maintained, as was the case in the Citizen for Democracy versus State of Assam case, in which Supreme Court declared that the handcuffs and other fetters shall not be forced upon a prisoner while lodged in jail. So thus it provided a guideline to the administrative institution so that human rights of prisoners can also be maintained. So having discussed the significances, let us quickly look into the issues with PIL. Now, first is that it disturbs the constitutional balance of power. Although the Indian Constitution does not follow any strict separation of power, it still embodies the doctrine of checks and balances, which even the judiciary should respect. The judiciary on several occasions did not exercise self-restraint and moved on to legislate, settle policy questions, take over governance and monitoring executive agencies, as was evident in the ban on liquor vends on highway judgment of the year 2016. In the year 2012, Harman Singh Sandhu filed a petition in the Supreme Court, highlighting issues of drink and drive accident on the national highways. In response to this PIL, Supreme Court banned the liquor vends from the highways. Now, this judgment was severely criticized as it created confusion, as well as experts says that this is the domain of the executive and not the judiciary to legislate or to direct on such matters. Another important challenge is the frivolous use. Now, PIL has become a tool for harassment as a result of the large number of insignificant cases that are filed by people with minimal court fee. Numerous false PILs have been filed to obtain publicity for unworthy causes. Even Chief Justice of India recently held that the PILs have become tools of harassment with vested personal interest. Experts are also of the opinion that the letter P, which stands for public, has been substituted for private and publicity. So, in order to pursue their personal cause or the hidden interest, several frivolous PIL litigations are being filed in the Supreme Court and the High Courts. And as the case with the today's news also, Supreme Court and High Court have several times raised concern over such frivolous issues. Now, another challenge is primacy to PIL cases over other cases. The debate over the limits of judicial activism in the area of PIL have been vigorous. A private member bill entitled PIL Regulation Bill was tabled in Rajya Sabha in the year 1996. The statement of objectives and reason stated that PIL was misused in the name of providing justice to the poor sections of the society, and also that PIL cases were given more priority over other cases, which led to pendency of several general section cases. However, the bill was never passed. Pendency is not limited to the general cases, but it also trickles down to the pendency in PIL cases also. Several PIL cases are being dragged on for 2 to 3 years in courts. So the very objective of a speedy justice has been defeated. Now, PIL should not be the first step in readdressing all kinds of grievances, even if they involve public interest. In order to remain effective, PIL should not be allowed to become a routine affair, which is not taken seriously by the bench, the bar, and most importantly by the masses. The overuse of PIL for every conceivable public interest might dilute the original commitment to use this remedy only for enforcing human rights of the victimized and the disadvantaged groups. If civil society and disadvantaged group lose faith in the efficacy of PIL, that would sound a death knell for it. So to conclude, we can say that PIL has an important role to play in the civil justice system in that it affords a ladder to justice to disadvantaged section of the society, some of which might not even be well informed about their rights. Furthermore, it provides an avenue to enforce diffused right for which either it is difficult to identify an aggrieved person or where aggrieved person have no incentives to knock at the doors of the courts. So PIL could also contribute to good governance by keeping the government accountable. Last but not the least, PIL enables civil society to play an active role in spreading social awareness about human rights, in providing voice to the marginalized section of society, and in allowing their participation in government decision making. So the plausible solution lies in the introspection and exercise of rationality by various stakeholders. First is judiciary must exercise caution and restraint while entertaining the PILs. That is, PIL should be admitted only when they comply with the guidelines of the Supreme Court. Frivolous PIL should be discouraged and penalized. There is need for sensitization of lawyers and social activists too. To conclude, we can say that executive inaction creates a space for such judicial activism. So if the concern is blurring of separation of power, executive must also act proactively and just not wait for the judiciary to take initiative for the burning questions of the society. Inspiration for our next discussion comes from this article which featured on page number 6 of the Hindu newspaper. According to author of this article, a high enough carbon tax can pave the way for decarbonization as a winning development formula. An author says India, as on the chair of G20 this year, can play a lead role in this regard. Environment and its protection has been an important theme from the perspective of UPSC examination. So as to trace your syllabus in General Studies Paper 3, Conservation, Environmental Pollution and Degradation, an environmental impact assessment has been mentioned. If you will look into the previous year preliminary examination, in 2021, UPSC asked a question based on common carbon metric. From the mains perspective also, decarbonization and its tools are pretty much important. As in 2014, it has asked a question that should the pursuit of carbon credit and clean development mechanisms set up under UNFCCC be maintained even though there has been a massive slide in the value of carbon credit. Discuss with respect to India's energy needs for economic growth. So there has been always a debate between growth and the sustainability of the environment. So in this discussion, we will be looking at what is carbon pricing, what is importance of carbon pricing, and what are the challenges related to carbon pricing. We will also look into what the author has to suggest in this regard, and then we will conclude this discussion. So let's begin the discussion. So the first and foremost question that lies ahead is what is carbon pricing? It is a tool that captures the external cost of greenhouse gases. Now, what is this external cost? External cost is a cost that public bears, such as crop damage, healthcare cost from heat waves and droughts, and property loss from flooding and sea level rise. And it ties them to their source through a price, usually in form of a price on the CO2 emitted. So next thing is the types of carbon pricing. Now there are two major types of carbon pricing. First is emission trading system, that is ETS. It is also known as cap and trade system. Now it sets a limit on the total GHG emissions and permits low emitting companies and countries to sell their excess allowances to higher emitting industries, as is the case in European Union and China. Now another method is carbon tax. It places a price on carbon by imposing a tax on greenhouse gases, or more typically the carbon content of fossil fuel, as is the case with the Korea and Singapore. Now for your understanding, tax on coal in India, which is currently is around 400 rupees per ton. Now there are some other mechanism also. First is result based climate finance, that is RBCF. It is a funding strategy in which payments are paid in response to predetermined outputs or outcomes connected to climate change management, such as emission reduction. Many RBCF programs also simultaneously aim to reduce poverty, improve access to clean energy, and offer health and community benefits. Another method is GHG emission reduction from projects or program based activities and are generally referred as offset mechanism, and they can be traded domestically or internationally. Offset programs have their own register and award carbon credits according to a system. Now, these credits can be utilized to address GHG mitigation compliance requirements under international agreements, domestic policies, or corporate citizenship goals. Now, lastly, there is another methodology, that is internal carbon pricing. It is a tool that an organization utilizes to steer its decision making process in relation to the impacts, risks, and opportunities of climate change. Now, let us look into what is the importance of carbon pricing. First is it follows the polluters pay principle. It holds emitters responsible for the emission rather than deciding on who should reduce emissions where and how. It incentivizes the emitters to transform their process to lower emission. In this way, the overall environmental goal is achieved in the most flexible and least cost way to society. Second significance is it places an adequate price on GHG emissions. It is of fundamental relevance to internalize the external cost of climate change in the broadest possible range of economic decision making and in setting economic incentives for clean development. Another significance is that it can help to mobilize the financial investments required to stimulate clean technology and market innovation, fueling new low carbon drivers of economic growth. For governments, carbon pricing is one of the instruments of the climate policy package and a source of revenue needed to reduce emission. Businesses use internal carbon pricing to evaluate the impact of mandatory carbon prices on their operations and as a tool to identify potential climate risks and revenue opportunities. Lastly, long-term investors use carbon pricing to analyze the potential impact of climate change policies on their investment portfolio. It allows them to reassess investment strategies and reallocate capital toward low carbon or climate resilient activities. Now let us quickly have a look at the challenges pertaining to carbon pricing. First is the political opposition. Now carbon pricing is often politically contentious as it can be seen as a tax on businesses and consumer. Politicians may be reluctant to support it due to concern about voter backlash. For example, in 2018, a ballot initiative to implement a carbon tax in Washington, USA state failed after a campaign that was largely funded by the fossil fuel industry. Second issue is complexity. Designing and implementing a carbon pricing system can be complex, especially in industries that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels. Another concern is related to the equity. Now, carbon pricing can disproportionately affect low income households and rural communities who may have fewer options for reducing their carbon footprint. Without careful consideration, carbon pricing can exacerbate existing inequalities, In India, a proposal to impose a carbon tax on coal production was met with opposition from some policymakers who argued that it would increase the cost of electricity for low income households. Critics also argued that a carbon tax would disproportionately affect rural communities who rely heavily on coal for cooking and heating. Another challenge lies in the lack of international cooperation. One of the challenges with carbon pricing is that businesses may simply move operation to countries with lower carbon pricing or lax environmental regulation. For example, if a country were to impose high carbon tax on manufacturing, companies might move their factories to a country with a lower tax. This would lead to a phenomena known as carbon leakage, in which emission reduction in one country which has a higher tax are offset by increase in another country which is having a lower tax structure. Now lastly, challenge lies in the enforcement. Enforcement of a carbon pricing system can be difficult, especially in industries that are not easily regulated. Without proper enforcement mechanism, carbon pricing may not effectively reduce emissions. In the European Union, there have been concerns about the effectiveness of the carbon pricing system in reducing emission. Now, according to author, among the different ways of pricing, India could find a carbon tax appealing. An author has also highlighted some reason for it. Firstly, author says that as it can directly discourage fossil fuels while raising revenues which can be invested in cleaner sources of energy or used to protect vulnerable consumers. Secondly, author says that it could replace the more inefficient scheme of petroleum taxes which are not directly aimed at emission. Thirdly, author says that in most of the countries, including India, fiscal policy has set in place the basic structure needed to implement a carbon tax. For example, they can be woven into road fuel taxes, which are established in most places and extended to industry and agriculture. India could start with the IMF figure of $25 per ton. Now, according to the author, the main obstacle is the argument by industrial firms about losing their competitive advantage to exporters from countries with a lower carbon price. So, to conclude, author says that any type of carbon pricing will face stiff political opposition. And a high enough carbon tax across China, US, India, Russia, Japan alone with complementary action could have a notable effect on global affluence and warming. It could also pave the way to seeing a decarbonization as a winning developmental formula. An author suggests that India, as president at the G20 summit this September, can play a lead role by tabling global carbon pricing in the existential fight against climate change. Now, our next discussion is primarily focused towards preliminary examination. An inspiration for this discussion comes from this news which featured on page number 10 of the Hindu newspaper. Now, according to the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, a total of 42.7 lakh loans amounting to around 5,152 crore has been disbursed to street vendors under the PM SVANidhi scheme, out of which only around 9.3% were to the hawkers belonging to minority communities. Now, as UPSC has been asking questions based on important schemes or government initiative, as you can see in 2016, UPSC has asked a question based on Stand Up India scheme. Now, try to attempt this question and let us know your answer in the comment box given below. Now, let us quickly have a look at the important information from the prelims point of view. Now, the PM Street Vendors Atmanirbhar Nidhi, that is PM SVANidhi scheme. It is a microcredit scheme which was launched in the year 2020 by Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. Its objective is to provide hand-holding support to street vendors to tide over the pandemic-induced economic stress. It facilitates collateral-free loan of rupees 10,000 with subsequent loans of rupees 20,000 and 50,000 with 7% interest subsidy. There is no penalty on early repayment of loan. Now, the duration of this scheme was initially until March 2022, but it has been extended till December 2024. Target beneficiaries include vendors, hawkers, thelewalas, rehriwalas in different areas who supply goods and services. Street vendors belonging to the surrounding peri-urban or rural areas are also included. Now, who can lend under this scheme? Scheduled commercial bank, regional rural bank, small finance bank, cooperative bank, non-banking financial companies, microfinance institution and SHG banks established in some states and UTs are allowed to lend under this scheme. Now, SIDBI, that is a Small Industries Development Bank of India, is the technical partner for implementation of this scheme and will manage the credit guarantee to the lending institutions through Credit Guarantee Fund Trust for Micro and Small Enterprises. The scheme is available for beneficiaries belonging to only those state and UTs which have notified rules and scheme under Street Vendor Protection, Livelihood and Regulation of Street Vending Act 2014. Beneficiaries from Meghalaya, which has its own state Street Vendors Act, may however participate. So the last topic of today's discussion comes from this news which featured on page number 1 of the Hindu newspaper. News is about rise in the net direct tax collection. Now, according to news, India's net direct tax collection have risen 17.6% in 2022-23 to touch 16.61 lakh crore, which has exceeded the revised estimate target for the year by 0.7%. Now, we will take up this discussion from the perspective of preliminary examination. As the details and information related to tax, GDP, etc., as the details related to the topic that has been mentioned as mobilization of resources, which includes subtopics like tax, GDP, etc., has been a recurring theme in UPSC examination. As in 2017, UPSC has asked a question based on GDP and the trend in fiscal deficit. So try to attempt this question and let us know your answer in the comment box given below. Now, as per the provisional data released by the Finance Ministry, India's net direct tax collection has risen by around 17.6% to touch around 16.61 lakh crore. It is a growth of around 17% in the year, which has exceeded the revised estimates target for the year by around 0.7%. Another finding is that the contribution of corporate tax collections in the gross direct tax kitty was around 10.04 lakh crore, just a tad higher than the 9.61 lakh crore paid by taxpayers as personal income tax and securities transaction tax, that is STT. Both personal income tax and STT yielded a growth of around 24.2%. At a gross level, the share of personal income tax and STT to the tax kitty has touched around 48.9% in 2022-23 compared to around 47.4% in 2021-22. While corporate tax accounted for just around 51.1% in the year gone by as opposed to 52.6% in 2021-22. The ministry said gross tax collection grew by around 20.33% to 19.68 lakh crore compared to 16.36 lakh crore in the previous financial year. Now here is a breakup of source of rupees that comes to the government. And this breakup has been provided by the recent budget. Income tax constitute around 15% while union excise duty constitute around 7%. Corporation tax contributes around 15%, whereas GST and other taxes constitute around 17%. Borrowing and other liabilities constitute 34% of the total income, while non-tax receipt constitute 6%, non-debt capital receipt constitute 2%, and custom duty constitute at around 4%. So that's all for today's discussion. Stay tuned for more such update.